Well, hello there. Are you ready to sew? Because I am. Hey friends, welcome back to my sewing room. My name is Becca, and in today's video, we are going to dive into block number 4 for the Bliss Quilt Along. This is a block of the month program that is included in sew sampler boxes that started shipping in April 2022 and will end in March 2023. And I am committed to making a tutorial video for every single block in this program. Though, as I've mentioned before, none of these patterns are mine, so I can't give you the cutting instructions. So every video will pick up from the point where I have starched, cut, and labeled my fabric according to the pattern instructions. And then I will walk you through step by step how I put that block together. If your fabric is not prepped and you need a couple of minutes to catch up, this is a great time to pause the video, go grab your fabric, get it all cut, get it all labeled, and meet me right back here. Block number 4 looks like a lot of fun to put together, and it is very reminiscent of a block that we put together for the Bright Side Quilt Along. I'm really excited to make this block again, and I think it's going to be beautiful in our finished quilt top. To get started, we're going to grab all 12 of our fabric A squares, and on the back side of these squares, we're going to draw a line from corner to corner. So I'm going to grab my little ruler and my air-soluble marking utensil. And I'm just gonna drag a line from the corner to corner on the back of each of these squares. We're going to pair up these squares with our fabric B squares, and we're going to use the stitch and flip method to assemble each of these squares to the corners of fabric B to build out our block. It's important that when you're drawing your line on the back of these squares, you are being accurate and making sure that they are starting in a corner and ending in a corner, because this is going to be the guide to make sure that we are stitching on a straight line perfectly in the middle on that diagonal. Now that all 12 of our fabric A squares are marked on the wrong side of the fabric, we're going to grab all 4 of our fabric B squares, and we're going to pair up 3 fabric A squares with 1 fabric B square, and we're going to do this 4 times. We're going to place our fabric A squares in 2 opposite corners, and we're going to stitch just 1 thread to the right of each of these lines. This is that stitch and flip method that we have done in previous sew-alongs multiple times. Once we've done these 2, then we'll come back and do this 3rd one. I don't want to do the 3rd one yet because you can see how this overlaps with these 2 pieces of fabric. I want to make sure that I have sewn these on, trimmed away my excess, and flipped them open before I put this 3rd square on, because this seam is going to intersect with just a little bit of these points right here to give us that 1/4 of an inch area where we'll stitch when we put the block in with the rest of our block pieces. So we're going to do these 2 seams first, and then we will trim, flip, and sew on the 3rd. When you place your squares on the opposite corners of your fabric B square, you want to make sure that that line you drew is going parallel to each other. You don't want them to touch. They should be running right alongside each other. If you have watched me make these blocks before, you know that whenever I do a stitch and flip method, if my excess is a decent size, I will take the time to stitch a second line just to the right, about a 1/2 inch from where I just sewed. And that means that when I come in and trim away my excess, I now have a fully sewn 1/2 square triangle unit that I can just square up and use in another project. Now that our excess is trimmed, we're going to press our seams open First, I'm going to do it with my finger, and that'll just get the seam to lay nice and open so that I can put some heat in there. I do like to press that with some heat before I sew my third square on, because that means that my seams are going to lay nice and flat, and it's going to make my fabric a little bit easier to manipulate. For my third and final square for this piece, we're going to line it up so that the line is touching each of the half square triangle points that we put on earlier. We're just going to do the same thing that we did before. We're going to stitch just a thread to the right of this line. And then if you want that bonus half square triangle unit, you'll repeat that sewing about a ½ inch away from the drawn line. Now, before you run off and do the other three, let me show you a little trick that I've learned with stitch and flips to test to make sure that I sewed my square on properly. After I've sewn my seam right next to that drawn line, I can put my finger in between these two pieces of fabric and just kind of nudge it over and crease it down with my finger. Now, if I'm looking at this new triangle of white that I just folded over should complete my square perfectly. This raw edge should be nice and straight and flush, and so should this. And it should be that way from both the top and the back. If this is shy, meaning it's not quite reaching the raw edges, it means that I stitched either on that line or to the left of it. And so I need to rip that seam out and try again. If this is bigger, when you flip it over, if it's bigger than what the backside is like this, then that means I wasn't close enough to the line. It means I'm too far to the right. For that one, I don't need to rip my stitch. I can just put it back in my machine and try again. When I flipped mine over and did my little test, everything looked okay. So I'm just going to trim off this excess. There's my bonus half square triangle unit. I'm going to press this out. And this is the unit that we're going to make 3 more of. When we're all done with this step, we should have 4 of those. Now I have all 4 of my units sewn together, and because we did stitch and flip, we really should not have been adding or taking away any of the size from these 4 squares. So if this was a 10-inch square before we added the snowball to those 3 corners, your pieces should still measure 10 inches. So just a little tip for you. Start with a 10-inch square, snowball all 4 of the corners, doesn't matter. Your piece should still end up 10 inches when you're done sewing on the corners. Our next step is going to have us grab all 4 of our fabric E-squares, which are right here, and we're going to do the same thing that we just did. This time we're going to assemble it on the corner that doesn't have any white triangle. Now we have 4 blocks that all look like this. Would you believe we're halfway done with this block? I'm not kidding. We're going to be done in a jiffy. In our next step, we're going to set this aside. We'll come back to them in just a few minutes, but we're going to make some 2 patches using our fabric C and our fabric F. We want to orient it so that fabric C is on the left and fabric F is on the right. We're going to make 4 of those units. Fabric F in my kit is a directional fabric, so I'm actually going to take an extra moment to lay out my fabric Fs the way they're going to be in the diagram in my pattern, and I'm going to also put my fabric C where they're going to touch my fabric Fs. This way I can make sure that when I go to sew my 2 patches together, I can take a minute to orient everything just the right way And when my block is all put together, all of my directional fabric is facing in the same direction. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. I just figured, why not? It's an extra step I can take now that'll make my block look a little more polished. The instructions do say that we're going to press all of these over towards our fabric C. So I've got all of mine folded open. Now it's time to get some heat in here to make them lay nice and flat. Would you believe that all we have left to do is assemble the block? I know, super easy, right? Let me show you how it's done. We're going to lay out all of our 2 patches so that our fabric C's are on the outer edge of the block. We'll grab our fabric D, that's going to go directly in the center, and then these units that we built out at the beginning of the video, we're going to put them in the 4 corners so that this fabric C triangle is pointing towards the middle. Now all we have to do is sew our rows and then put our rows together and our block is done. So I'm going to do this row and these seams are going to press in towards the middle, and the middle row is going to press out. To make this easy, I'm going to pick up my middle piece and lay it on top of my left piece. And now I know I just need to stitch down this edge. So this is piece 1, piece 2, piece 3. And now from my 3rd column, I'm going to pick up piece 1, piece 2, and piece 3, making sure that this is the edge that I'm going to stitch on. So I didn't change the orientation of those blocks. Now if I pick it up like this and carry it to my machine, it's a little bit easier for me to do some assembly line sewing. I'm going to pick up my first 2 pieces. I'm going to line up the raw edges, and I'm going to be very careful to make sure that I am not turning or twisting the orientation of this block at all. Cut my thread after that. I'm going to pick up my next 2 pieces, being very careful to line up my raw edge but not turn my block at all, and sew. Cut my thread. And then I'm going to do the same thing down here too. Don't turn the block, just line up your raw edges and sew. Now remember, for the top and bottom rows, we're going to press the fabric towards the middle, and the middle we're going to press away from the middle. So I'm just going to finger press these. And from this pile over here, I have all 3 of my pieces, row 1, row 2, and row 3, in that order in this stack. And the side that I'm going to sew onto my rows is facing my machine. It's already there. I don't have to twist it or turn it at all. I'm just going to make my stacks again, making sure to keep the left side that I'm joining and the right side that I'm joining, both of them are kind of facing each other. That helps keep the fabric oriented so I don't get twisted or turned around. Now I just need to give my rows a really good press, remembering the top and bottom row, I am pressing towards that center section, and the middle row, I am pressing away from that center section. We're doing this first with our fingers, and then I'm going to do it with my iron so that everything's laying really nice and flat and cooperating a little bit better when I put my 3 rows together. I'm going to start by putting my middle row onto my bottom row. Now all of my seams should nest around that center square. So I'm taking a moment to hold the seam right around that center portion, make sure everything's nested up nicely. And then once my needle gets into that seam, I'll let go of it, grab my next intersection that I care about, hold that, and let the rest of the seam go through the machine. The pattern wants us to press away from the center row when we're putting our outer rows on. So I'm just going to hand press that down. I'm going to grab my last row, put it on top. I've mentioned this before, but all nesting is when you have seams, I'll show you up here, that are going in opposite directions, they should be kissing each other. There should not be a gap between those two seams, and they shouldn't be laying on top of each other. And if you roll them between your thumb and your forefinger, you can feel if they are properly lined up. Sometimes you might be a little overlap, sometimes there might be a teeny bit of a gap, but usually it's close enough that you get the overall point across when you're putting your blocks together. I like to do this method. I hold it between my finger and my thumb. Then when I get to my machine, I just lay it on the bed of my machine and my pointer finger stays on top of this seam. And I let the machine pull all the fabric in. And then once that needle is in the seam, I stop, I line up my next seam, feel it with my finger to make sure it feels lined up, nested nicely, and then I stitch until my needle is in that seam, and then I'll hold the next spot and keep going. It's not a perfect way to piece, I'll give you that. Sometimes I goof and I'll either have a gap, which means my point is floating, or I might have an overlap, which means I'm gonna cut off my point. I don't always get perfect points by doing this, but I do save quite a bit of time and frustration from having to deal with clips and pins. This is my preferred method of putting blocks together. I only do that when I'm assembling blocks. Whenever I'm putting blocks into a bigger layout or putting rows together, I will take the time to stop and pin and clip just because that makes sure that the pieces I'm putting together are approximately the same size. There's nothing more frustrating than sewing along and you get down to the bottom of your row and they're off by a ½ inch or more. That's horrible. If I take the time to clip or pin a row, then I know that my rows are going to be about the same size. And if I have to ease something in, I know ahead of time. Just like the pattern said, we're going to press this center row out towards the outer rows. I'm going to do that from the back first, just with my fingers. Then I'll turn the block over, press it with my hand to make sure everything feels like it's going in the right direction. Nothing's twisted, nothing's folded on top of itself. A little bit there. There's a bit of bulk here, and the best way to get this to lay flat is giving the block a good, nice shot of heat and steam and starch and all of the things that you use. Bring out all the tools to get this block to lay really nice and flat. So the first thing that I do is a hot, dry iron right on top of the block. And then a big gulp dose of Best Press. Yeah, I really use that much Best Press. And then my ultra gigantic custom 12-inch clapper right on top of the block. So the entire block is cooling with this uniform pressure applied to all of the seams. This is going to help make sure that when my block is completely cooled and all done, the memory for each of those seams is set to the ultra flat position, making sure that my block has some body because I use some Best Press. It's not going to fray over time because of the Best Press, but those seams are as flat and crisp as I can possibly get them. It doesn't take long for this block of wood to absorb the heat from my fabric. Now all I have left to do is square this beautiful block up to 10½ inches square. I love how this one turned out, and I think taking the time to orient these 4 fabric F squares so that the directional print is all going in the same direction just is an added bonus to this block. So today is the last Saturday in the month of August, and you all know I've been taking this entire month to release a video every single Saturday until I got caught up on the Bliss quilt along. As of the recording of this video, the August 2022 boxes have not been sent, so technically right now I'm caught up. But by the time this video is dropped and you're watching it, we should have received our August 2022 box, meaning block 5 is in there, and we are now officially behind again. But don't worry, because we're going to get that caught up really quick. As long as the August box shipped on time, next week Next Saturday at 9 a.m. will be block number 5. And then after that, we will continue a rhythm where the first Saturday of every single month at 9 a.m., I will post a video for the block that we got in the prior month's box. So the first Saturday in October, you guessed it, we're going to do block number 6, which will be in September's box.